Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, run by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. We at Closer to Truth are thrilled to collaborate. In our panels, we bring together philosophers and scholars from different traditions to explore common topics. We invite diverse ways of thinking, but we do not avoid conflicts, even contradictions, real or apparent. This panel is on the existence of God or deities and is being pre-recorded due to panelists' time zones and schedules. We have a small audience who will pose some questions at the end. So I'd like to begin by asking each panelist to introduce themselves and their primary research interests. Please keep it short. Now, I worry about the order of traditions. I don't want to play any favorites here, so trying to be objective, so I'll use alphabetizing. So I'll start with African philosophy, Motsamai Molefe.
Thank you. I'm currently based at the University of Hare in the province of, the eastern province of the country. I specialize mainly in African philosophy, moral philosophy, applied ethics, and political philosophy. Thank you.
Indian philosophy, Jessica Frazier.
I am at the University of Oxford and the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and I work on a combination of Indian philosophy on one hand, especially metaphysical, ontological, phenomenological questions, and German philosophy, European continental philosophy on the other hand, also metaphysical, ontological, phenomenological questions, all in relation to religion.
Islamic philosopher, Nazif Muhtaroğlu.
Oh, thank you, Robert. I am currently affiliated with Bahçeşehir University in Istanbul, Turkey. I am mainly interested in religious epistemology and metaphysics, and specifically with the question of God. But my focused research interest is in occasionalism, a theory which has roots both in Islamic and Christian traditions. And I try to study it in terms of both in the modern context and Islamic context.
Jewish philosophy, Jewish is last, Samuel Lebens, I'm not, Jewish is last, but J is only the 10th letter in the alphabet. So I noticed that the four contributors in the first third are all there. So Jewish philosophy.
Hi, so my name is Sam Lebens. I work at the University of Haifa in the philosophy department in Israel. I work in a number of different fields, history of early analytic philosophy with a particular interest in the work of Bertrand Russell, who isn't well known for being a Jewish theist, because he wasn't. And I also do work in the philosophy of religion, specifically in Jewish philosophy, on the nature of faith, and on the nature of space and time in certain mystical Jewish traditions.
Okay, let's get to our questions on the existence of God or deities. Now, in the historical development of each of your traditions, are there arguments for the existence of God or deities? So if so, what are the themes and flows of these arguments? And conversely, are there arguments within the tradition for the non-existence of God, disputes within the tradition? And then as the historical development has occurred, what about the contemporary interest in such arguments for or against God's existence? And so this time, in terms of choosing who to go first, I decided to do it by the length of the history that I will estimate. So in this case, let's start with Jessica and Indian philosophy and history in terms of the arguments about the existence of God.
So my thoughts about the beginnings of even the concept of God in India in relation to Hinduism is that while you've got the classic thing of nature deities, the real philosophical content of the Hindu tradition begins with arguments for why there must be something like God. So in the ancient Vedas, we're talking about 1500 BC, a little after. Already they're talking about questions on what is it that is the source of being in the universe? What is it that is the fabric of all things? What is the impulse that set creation going? Those kinds of very, very early questions, already by the time you get to about 800 BC, they're turning into a more formal kind of philosophical question. What is the efficient cause of the universe? Aristotle's causes kind of are reflected here. What is the efficient cause that sets it going? What's the formal cause that gives it shape? This is familiar from Western causal arguments for God, Western design arguments for God. They're mirrored. But Hinduism also thinks that God is the material cause of the universe, right? It's also what the universe is ultimately made of and grounded in. So we have something a little bit like the ontological argument, but something that basically is taking all three of these kinds of causation and saying, whatever the universe is, that requires something that would have to be the cause of them in all these senses. And that's how it starts to get in the Upanishads to the notion of God, which is interesting because it means you can get to God just by looking at the world around us. In terms of arguments against it, well, Hinduism has perhaps one of the world's most extreme critics in Buddhism, which from around 300 BC says this whole inference to something behind causation we see, the causal argument, this inference to something that creates the forms, patterns, and structures, the design argument, and the inference that there must be a deeper level of being that is the source of everything. All of them are rejected by the Buddhists. It's really a bit like reading David Hume's arguments concerning natural religion. And so Hinduism and Buddhism, the radical sort of ontological believers in a foundation of everything, and Buddhism, the ultimate skeptics, continued to develop together from 300 BC onwards into a long tradition that debates these issues.
Sam, Jewish philosophy.
I think there's a sense in which Jewish philosophy begins surprisingly late. And I'll try and explain what I mean. In some of the rabbinic literature from about the 2nd century before the Common Era onwards, you see hints towards arguments for the existence of God in certain pieces of literature known as midrash, which are rabbinic collections of homilies and interpretations of the biblical texts. And what you see is perhaps the kernel of a design argument, perhaps again the kernel of an ontological argument. It was interesting to hear Jessica speak about Hindus thinking in terms of God almost as like a substance out of which the universe was formed. There is some hints towards that in Second Temple Judaism. So we're talking about the last couple of centuries before the Common Era, where they even start to speak about God as the makom, meaning the place in which the universe occurs. Somehow it occurs within God. But these are all kind of, you really have to reconstruct those arguments, because the Midrash is much like prose poetry. It doesn't read like a philosophical tradition, and I don't think it was intended to be a philosophical tradition. The first time you really find systematic Jewish theology in the rabbinic movement is really probably as late as the 10th century CE, with people like Sa'adja Gaon, who was born in Egypt but lived in modern day Iraq. And he engages in arguments that I think he's very much borrowed from Greek philosophy, and that came down to him through Christians like John Philoponus, and also through the Muslim philosophers, the Mutakallimim, who he was engaged with very much, was even perhaps a member of their kind of intellectual milieu. So you see things like the cosmological argument, which is the kind of appeal to God as the cause of causes, so to speak, the cause of the cosmos, design arguments. You see all of the regular fare. But I think if you're looking, Robert, for something distinctive in the Jewish tradition, as early as this thinker, Sa'adja Gaon, in the 10th century, and you see it also soon after him in the work of Yehuda Halevi, the great Spanish poet and philosopher and theologian, is that the Jewish tradition almost prefers to think about God in terms of our own peculiar personal relationship than in terms of a conclusion that one reaches at the end of a philosophical argument. So what this looks like is, we know that God exists because he moves through Jewish history. And you start to see arguments that say, how could this have happened in Jewish history were it not for the existence of God. And in fact, I suppose in some ways, the most surprising thing about Jewish history just is our survival. That 2,000 years of exile after we were quite brutally taken out of the Middle East by the Romans and the Hadrianic persecutions, that we survived as a people dispersed, is looked at as an argument for the existence of God.
Okay, let's go on to African philosophy. Motsamai, you have focused on a very interesting idea that in traditional African religion is really what you've called a neglected form of monotheism. So I'd like to see how that, how your thinking has developed.
If you talk to an average person in African cultures, you get a sense that there's a general belief that there's one God, and he's referred to the names that are used to refer to God among different African languages, also point out to this single existent being that is responsible for everything in the world. So the idea of monotheism is just so obvious, in African cultures, that does not even need to be defended, because the very linguistic structure that informs the very metaphysics of God presupposes monotheism. Just to answer that question directly, that is that. But what's interesting about African philosophy of religion is that it emerges in a very complicated context. I mean, formal African philosophy can be traced to around the 1960s and 1970s. And because of the history of independence, African philosophers have, for the most part, been preoccupied with, morality, questions of justice, and political philosophy. And African philosophy of religion then becomes, a victim, because it is also neglected even within, philosophy of religion. And then questions surrounding God are traditionally then focus of theologians. So what theologians do, they engage in anthropological studies, in something like cultural studies, that simply want to respond to the colonial onslaught that there's no concept of God in African tradition. So much of the literature wants to argue that there is a concept of God in African tradition, but what becomes missing in the literature is arguments for the existence of God. So one of the things you will pick up that we are starting to look into as African philosophers is, could we come with arguments that rationally demonstrate the existence of God?
Do you see some differences among different African areas, different African religions? Because to people in the West, Africa is a general word, but there are dozens and hundreds, perhaps, of different cultural expressions within Africa. So do you see distinctions among them?
It depends in terms of what. So generally there is uniformity in terms of for example, if you look into the Akans, you look into the Yoruba, commitment to monotheism, it's also structured. I belong to the Bantu group. If you look into the languages that they use to refer to God, it's an overtly monotheistic aspect. But when you look into the cultural procedures and taboos to express how to relate to this God, that's where you're going to see differences. But it seems the underlying philosophical tenets and assumptions, they seem to be, sufficiently similar.
That's it. Very interesting. Nazif, in Islamic philosophy, Middle Ages has been great theories developed, great approaches to the existence of God that has then influenced both Christian and Jewish philosophers. But you've talked about kind of a unique argument that you call the cosmological argument from agency. How does that work, and how does it differ from the traditional kalam cosmological argument?
Okay, let's get started with the general overview. In the Islamic intellectual history, there are two main traditions in which we can find the rational arguments for the existence of God. The Falsafa tradition, which is basically the Neoplatonic Aristotelian type of philosophizing, and the Kalam tradition, which is by and large the philosophical theology, but it has a much larger scope than theology as understood today. It includes ethics, politics, epistemology, and metaphysics. So in these two traditions, we find several arguments for the existence of God, even ontological argument, according to some scholars, but I don't agree that there is a specific type of ontological argument. The basic type of argument is an inference from the universe to the existence of God. And by and large, it's a kind of cosmological argument. However, when we look at the details of the discussion, the philosophy tradition tries to emphasize a certain concept of God inferred from the universe. They usually use the argument from contingency to argue for the existence of a necessary being. But that necessary being acts out of nature, and his act is determined by the necessity of its nature. And this is why they call it vacib el-vücud mucib bizzat, the necessary being that acts out of the necessity of its nature. And the Kalam people, the scholars within the Kalam tradition, rejects this kind of concept and try to argue for a necessary being who acts with free will. And this is called vacib el-vücud fa'il muhtar. So in order to sustain this idea, they appeal to several arguments. One famous argument is Delil el-Hudus, which is updated by William Lake Craig as the Kalam cosmological argument, which tries to show that the universe is a beginning and then argue for the existence of a free God. They also use the argument from contingency, and we can also find design arguments. But my research showed me that some scholars use these features, temporality, contingency, and design, all together within a single form of argument, rather than using them separately as individual arguments. And this is what I found in al-Baqillani's text, which is a Kalam scholar from the Asharite tradition. He tries to argue for the existence of God by showing the temporality of the universe. But at that stage, he calls that being who is responsible for the temporality of the universe, the maker, muhtis, not God, the maker. And then he tries to show that the universe exemplifies contingency. Many different things exemplify various forms that could have been otherwise. And on the basis of this idea, he tries to show that this maker has free will. Then he tries to show that there is a certain order in this universe. And on the basis of this idea, he argues that this maker has knowledge. And all these attributes have maximal scope. They are not contingent or limited, since God is eternal or necessary. And at the end, he shows that there is only one such being, no two, no three, only one. And after that point, he calls that being Allah, the proper name used for God in English with capital G. So this shows us that the argument for the existence of God is a kind of meta-argument that involves the Kalam cosmological argument, the contingency argument, and the design argument, as well as a separate argument for the uniqueness of that being. And this is, I think, is very peculiar, because the argument for the uniqueness of God, that there is only one God, is not separate from the existence of God. This is what I found in my research.
Okay, let's just have a quick response from everyone in terms of the level of importance that arguments for or against God or about God exist in the current scholarly approach in each of your traditions, and not common people, but from the scholarly. How important are existence arguments for God contemporarily? Jessica?
Interesting to ask about the contemporary situation, because in some ways, often the question is whether people are still doing that kind of theology today that they did in 1200. Right. I think that people are, in a sense, accepting the old arguments. and not working through them in a new way, mostly in the Hindu world. So there isn't much traditional philosophical scholarship of that kind being done.
Okay, that's fine. Sam, in Jewish philosophy, which of course I've had some experience personally with, there is very little discussions of these within traditional Judaism, although some people like yourself do philosophical work.
Yeah, I'd say the real creativity for a long time in kind of Jewish scholarship, there's been creativity in terms of halachic innovation, which is about Jewish law, Jewish jurisprudence. The Talmud is a big compendium of all sorts of debates, and there's in Jewish scholarship really celebrates trying to reconstruct those arguments, deepen those arguments. They don't tend to be arguments for the existence of God. In fact, even in the sort of work that I do, we're really looking often at the philosophical consequences of belief in God rather than trying to prove that God exists.
Motsamai, you made a very interesting point before that because of the history in Africa, there's been now kind of a resurgence or a blossoming of African philosophy about these kinds of questions much more contemporarily than have existed in the other traditions.
What is beginning to happen is interest is starting to move away from political issues to more traditional philosophical questions. And one of those are questions surrounding the existence of God, particularly in metaphysics. So that is where we're hoping in the coming 5 to 10 years, we're going to start seeing philosophical arguments for, giving extensive exposition of the concept of God within. I know there are scholars who have done that, John Beatty. But what I have been doing personally in my research is to assume the existence of God, but extrapolate from it a particular kind of a moral system. But what I think we're really looking for, it's the arguments that will be, focusing precisely on saying what arguments can be proffered for the existence of God. The indications that I'm seeing in the traditions that are promising are similar to other traditions, because you'll find scholars indicating that the existence of God is to be inferred, from the awe that you encounter when you look into the universe. The order that you see in the universe could be a basis, for arguing for God. But what we're expecting in the contemporary space is the details and the philosophical work done on that. And I'm hoping that in the coming few years that will be coming out.
That's very exciting, I think, because each of the other traditions go way back in human knowledge. And in Africa now we have this new flourishing about some of the old ideas. So we look to you to maybe come up with some novel or different or interesting approaches that these other guys have forgotten about. Now, it's up to you to bring humanity forward. I have to make another comment, because as everybody probably sees, there are no Christian philosophers on this panel. No reason why not. We have Christian philosophers in other panels. We only had 4 spaces, and I don't want to represent Christian philosophy, although we do a lot on Closer to Truth, which is why global philosophy of religion is a good balancer for us. But nobody obviously today has mentioned the Trinity. And I would assume without discussion that all of you would not think that is a representation of the reality. But Christian philosophy, of course, spends a great deal of time on that topic. So I want to go on to the next question, which is how can we know God or deities, and know, I'm using in the most general sense, what are the ways through which a knowledge of God or deities is acquired? And what are the epistemological ways of thinking? And then how can one be sure of the reliability of these ways? Again, I want to do this in alphabetical order, but as I looked at it, every time I would have alphabetical, Jessica would always come first. And so what I want to do now is do alphabetical order, but in reverse alphabetical order. So Jessica now will come last. Sorry, Jessica. Sam, let's start with you. You talk about a revelation through concealment, the hiddenness of God, and that this is that there's a Kabbalistic, the Jewish mysticism response to God's hiddenness. How does that work?
Well, so the background to that and to that paper that you're referring to that I wrote about the hiddenness of God is that in recent years, under the influence of John Schellenberg, a Canadian philosopher of religion.
We know John; he's a great contributor to Closer to Truth.
Right, so. Right. So he is kind of developed an argument against a certain sort of theism, and it's called the argument from divine hiddenness. And his basic idea is that if God, understood in a certain way, really existed, you wouldn't expect to find very many people failing to believe in him. Very many, sincerely searching people failing to believe in him. And yet there's lots of sincerely searching people who don't quite succeed to believe in him. And that indicates that indeed he doesn't exist. And what I argued was that in the Kabbalah, there's a kind of expectance that God would be in some respect hidden. You see, it was taken for granted, perhaps because of revelation, and perhaps you could supplement that revelation with something like an ontological argument. There are many people who've come to believe there exists a completely perfect being, and what the Kabbalistic tradition suggests is that for one reason or another, a perfect being actually wouldn't be able to coexist alongside perhaps anything else. There's this notion of there not being space for anything more than God. And I talk about this not as actual geometrical space, but something like logical space. God's perfection somehow doesn't leave room for anything else to exist alongside him. And therefore, in order for God to create the world, he, so to speak, had to rein in his perfection. And there are two ways of understanding this in classical Jewish mysticism. One way is quite literal, that God actually somehow reined in his perfection, and temporarily at least, he's not truly perfect. He will be again one day. But as he coexists with the universe, he's volunteered to be somehow less than perfect. The view that I prefer, and I think is the more common view among the Hasidic movements, which was this kind of Eastern European revival of Jewish mysticism from the 1700s onwards, their preferred view was that, no, God can't actually reign in his perfection. Perfection can't do that either. So instead, God creates the illusion of reigning in his perfection, which creates the illusion of some space, which allows him to create the illusion of a universe that's distinct from him. So in actual fact, we have to talk about the universe on two respects. The universe as it appears within the story that God is dreaming up, and God as he really is beyond the story, which is completely and utterly alone. And therefore, in the story, we shouldn't necessarily expect to see God's perfection totally manifest. It's somewhat hidden within the story.
Nazif, you talk about any discussion about the existence of God or gods. It cannot be independent, as you said, of your concept or understanding of God. And in Islamic tradition, the issue of God's uniqueness has a central place, that there is only one God is a precondition to be able to use this name, as you said, with a capital J. And so given that, what is the process by which human beings can know God?
Indeed, this approach is represented by the Kalam scholars, not everybody, apparently, because apart from the rational arguments for the existence of God, I can identify three main ways to talk about the existence of God without relying on arguments. The first one is the literalist approach, which accepts the existence of God just because it is in the Quran. I mean, it's very, ordinary way of seeing things, but it is viciously circular and criticized by many other Muslims. The second way is represented by Ibn Taymiyyah. He talks about a primordial human nature, which is called fitra.
So those three arguments, I mean, I can try to trace that in other traditions. The first one is just pure revelation. You just got to accept what the scripture says. The second one, that it is an inherent aspect of human nature, resonates well with Al Planting as being properly basic. It's the basic understanding. We know God is like we know that you have there's other minds, or that we believe in the past. I mean, it's fundamental to us. And the third way is this mystical experience. I noticed you didn't articulate, kind of philosophical arguments as one of them, but I could maybe, if you take those four, that represents everyone. Motsamai, you've written that about how God's nature is conceived, how God's will is meant to bear on human decision-making, questions about what happens after the death of one's body, or even how long one can exist without a body. I mean, these kinds of metaphysical questions about humanity. How does that relate to a human being's a capacity to know God?
Thanks a lot. Look, so one of the fundamental assumptions that you find in African cultures generally is that God is not a being that you can teach to another human being. His existence is so obvious that not even a child needs to be taught God. And that kind of supposition is supported by so on the one hand, there is the idea that if you look into the structure of African cultures, so there is no revelation, right? Because there is no institutional religion. So you won't find, so there was no established practice of people going to a particular place to worship God, right? So you find that. And how then do people come to know about God? So one common answer that emerges in the literature is that people come to know God through their everyday activities. God is spread throughout the universe, that as you engage in various activities in life, you encounter different aspects and traces of divinity. And through those encounters, then God, people encounter him in that way. So that is one strand of thought. But an interesting strand of thought, which I don't explore in the paper you're talking about, is how God is known through the family. And the idea of the family in the African tradition is interesting because central to the family is it's the idea of ancestors. So ancestors are human beings who are now dead, but now they live in a new form. And now the role of the ancestors is to connect the family, the extant living family in the body, with God. So in the family home, the very existence in ancestors is one veritable way of connecting one and with knowledge about God himself. So ancestors become that conduit. But now the tricky question then becomes, but how do we access ancestors themselves, because they are spiritual? So you seem to have ancestors who in the first place themselves are spiritual. We can engage them physically, And then we have God also, who's also spiritual, we can access physically. So there's one way to think about this, and this is rather cultural rather than philosophical. So the idea is that there are experts in African cultures who know how to really connect with the supernatural being, right? But that doesn't solve the philosophical question that how do I, as an ordinary person who so happens to believe in the ancestors, actually come to formulate a belief in the ancestor and come to formulate a belief that they are connected to God. So I think those are the two ways to think about knowledge of God. At best, these are based on intuition. Right? These are based on intuition. So some kind of intuitionism.
Jessica, let's talk about the Indian concepts of reality, Vedantic metaphysics, an area of your specialty. How does Indian metaphysics, its approach to the concept of raw being, relate to our way of knowing if and what is God?
Well, I think it's doing something very similar to the classic Western approaches, right? If an inference is central to this. There's a moment, one of the earliest texts, the Chandogya Upanishad, it gets picked up in the Sankhya Karaka. We're looking at around 508 to 500 BC. They discover inference and they're excited about it. And there's a moment where they say, look, anything where you see changing phenomena, but which have a structure, a repeated fundamental structure, that means there must be a substrate underneath it. Right? It's very important. And the Buddhists had said, no, there's no substrate, things just change. And the Hindus say, but wait, if things had nothing underneath supporting it, things would change in a chaotic way, right? So we see order, and so you can see how the formal kind of design idea comes in. We see it moving, but moving in a direction, a kind of telos going through everything. There must be a substance that is underneath. And in a sense, in Hinduism, you don't have the crisis of faith that we had in Western modernity, because just already to have a single underlying ground of everything leads Hinduism to the kind of monistic or pantheistic philosophical perspective that underlies its conception of God. You don't need to wonder if God's there. This is already giving you the evidence from which you can infer that. And it's nice in a way that you're not kind of questioning whether God's there so much in the Hindu world. You're just trying to understand it and get it right, which is why in Hinduism, the old word for a seer in the revelatory text, the rishi, they're perceiving reality. They're not told by God. They know because they can perceive directly into reality. And so in a sense, philosophers, even physicists, are doing a similar kind of work. And maybe just one last interesting thing about the way that works, you get a lot of scholastic philosophers arguing for inference, proving different things about the divine, that it has to be self-existent, aseity in the classic scholarly traditions, that it has to be infinitely creative, have a kind of creative power, etc. But you also get a really cool transcendental argument for God through yoga, right? So in India, you've always got two directions of empirical awareness. One outward, observing the world, the other inward, because there's a profound phenomenological tradition from like 300 BC. Look inside, again, changing phenomena of the mind, but what's always there as the underlying foundation necessary for them? It's consciousness itself. So that the transcendental sort of argument that consciousness has to be present for all that we know gives you a God which is both the foundation of nature and the foundation of consciousness as well, but always present.
Look, that's great. And that leads directly into our next question, which deals with religious and mystical experiences. All religions have that to one degree or another. But in each of your traditions, how important are such religious, mystical, personal experiences in apprehending and worshiping God? And as I said, we're going to stick with some alphabetical, this time by last names. And again, Jessica always comes first when we do it fairly. And so I'd like you just to describe how important in a contemporary sense are these mystical traditions within the yoga tradition, within this concept of personal consciousness relating to the cosmic consciousness?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, okay, so if you think of incarnation in Christianity as God condensing himself and becoming part of the world so we can directly perceive it, Hinduism believes that happens all the time, right? So it's not once, it's always there. And there are many ways to directly perceive the divine in various different forms. It's one of the things that's distinctive about the tradition. You can meet the divine in an embodied form. There are mountains, there are people, there are all kinds of things or images that can be seen as temporary, direct, kind of temporary bodies almost, that the divine takes on to be accessible. So in some sense of a direct encounter, Hinduism, direct access, revelation, experiences of God happen all the time. But what's interesting that is also that can come in many forms. So you can have an embodied physical manifestation, a mental manifestation of the divine. You can discover within your own being, your consciousness, your awareness through meditative strategies, and even through your own emotion. You can make direct access with God. Emotion in the West is often seen as some unimportant epiphenomenon of reality. Weird organisms like humans do it. In Hinduism, it's often seen as one of the most important and profound forms that the divine takes. So you've got lots of different routes to make that access.
Sam, in Jewish philosophy, mystical experiences, religious experiences, the apperceptions of God, how important is that?
Well, there's a long tradition of it. I mean, and Jewish mysticism, one of the earliest forms of Jewish mysticism, is called the Heichalot literature, which describes. They almost created manuals for the generation of mystical experiences, and they were quite radical and vivid ones, where they would ascend to these different levels of heaven and enter divine palaces. But nonetheless, however vivid and however old these traditions are, they were never really the kind of main day-to-day religious expression of the Jewish people. And actually, to answer your question, Robert, I think I can relate to the previous question. You said in response to Nazif's last contribution, you kind of arranged the field by saying, look, you can come to know, people claim to know God through revelation, through scripture. You said also some people just claim to know it, just have a basic, in Plantinga's language, a properly basic belief. Then you spoke of mystical experience. And yes, like I said, there are Jews who practice mystical routines, so to speak, and mystical ritual in order to invoke such experiences. And you also said philosophy can give people access to God, inference from argument, to use, Jessica was talking about inference. But what really interested me about Motsamai's African perspective is the addition really of a fifth element. You spoke about family, Motsamai, but in Judaism we talk about the Jewish people, and there's something that's more like a corporate knowledge. So it's not that an individual has a relationship with God, but a particular community, and ancestors is very important. And it's not in the African way of relating to our dead ancestors as kind of spiritually present with us, but in terms of, well, I know God exists because my parents told me, and their parents told them, and their parents told them, and there's this unbroken chain that goes all the way back to a mass revelation at Mount Sinai, right? And this was actually the argument for God's existence that I was referring to of Yehuda Halevi. He just says that it's a really remarkable claim the Jewish people make, that the entire corporate body of Israel witnessed a theophany together and passed it down in an unbroken chain. At what point in history would the whole generation have been deceived that happened? And therefore it's a corporate knowledge. It's we know that God exists because we belong to this community. And I think that's probably more important to the day-to-day Jewish life than vivid mystical experience, even though we do pray 3 times a day, but some people are better at mystical experience than others.
Motsamai, in African religions and belief systems, how often do you see mystical experiences, ecstatic experiences being part of the African religious experience?
Well, I think it comes very close to the Jewish tradition, because the family is so central. And the most important operations happen in the family. And when we talk of an ancestor, each family has got its own ancestors. And these ancestors are the ones that connect you to the spiritual realm of the divine directly. Though themselves ancestors are not divine, they're considered to be persons. So, so, and then each family has got a specialist that they consult, if there's a crisis. But what's really interesting then, it's the communication that happens. Sometimes the communication will take a form of a sick. So sometimes you see the mystical experience could take a form of your animals dying, or it could take a form of a sick, of one of your children being very sick, or could take a form of someone being born disabled. And that could just be a form of a mystical experience that requires you to pay attention, But we're not lost also to the idea that they are special, and they're called special because they're not common. People where they claim to have revelations. They claim to have revelations. But I think the substance of mystical experiences is not removed from, it's just ordinary. There's something ordinary about them. And this ordinariness about them is intrinsically connected to a lived life within a particular, family and community. Family and community. And you understand that when we talk about family here, not only do we include, what we call the living dead or ancestors, but you really thinking of an extended family, that goes beyond the nucleus family. And this family in a way becomes, an archive of knowledge, because there are various then rituals of communication and all of that, right? But all of this is still at an anthropological level, right? So what needs to be done philosophically then, it's one, how then this, because when I look into the concept of an ancestor, for me as a philosopher, it is useful as a moral tool, but not so much as a metaphysical tool, because as a moral tool, it gives you an exemplar of morality. This is one person who's lived a morally excellent life. So the concept of an ancestor is useful for me as an ethical tool, but metaphysically, there is no literature that can say, look, these are reasons why you must believe that when we die, we take a new form. So for it to be epistemically useful, to support a particular metaphysical view, a lot of metaphysical work, still needs to be done. But as an ethical resource, I find it to be very powerful.
Nazif, let's talk about the role of mystical experiences in the history of Islam and Islamic philosophy. I'm certainly not an expert, but as I've looked at Sufism, which has been called Islamic mysticism or Islamic intensification in some cases, I see some controversy about it, that some people believe that that's really the best way to God, and others substantially reject it, certainly reject a large number of the so-called Sufis. And so give us a sense of mysticism in general, its importance in Islam, and in particular, the different approaches to Sufism.
Sure. The controversy stems from certain various types of practice within Sufism or mysticism, Islamic mysticism. Because in the Middle Ages, some Sufis claim to be God. They said, I am God, or similar pronouncements appeared, and this immediately drew attention of the orthodoxy, and they were harshly criticized. But in time, what we have seen in the Islamic world is the Sufi tradition became much more aligned with the orthodoxy. And I think Ghazali has a very crucial role in this transformation, because he started his career as a Kalam scholar, but later he turned to be a Sufi. He knows both traditions and interpreted them in a way they can cohere with each other. So he said, Kalam is good, but not enough. So we need spiritual experience to complete and perfect our humanity. And this is how it is understood, even contemporary skin. Sufism is a much alive way of living the religious experience today. There are many different orders, Sufi orders, all around the world, in the Islamic world. And it is much more aligned with the Quranic teaching today.
Okay, I want to ask this question, and please be brief. I mean, it's not quite a yes/no question, but I'd like to understand a critical question, which I look upon it metaphysically, but it also has political and social implications, and that is this: from the perspective of your tradition, do all religions worship the same God or the same deities or ground of being? The nice answer is yes, but then the follow-up is, what do you do about all the overt contradictions between the religious traditions? Let's, in my alphabetizing, I keep putting Nazif last, and I'm embarrassed about that. So for this question, Nazif, please go first.
Okay, thanks. Islam, especially the Quranic teaching, accepts Christianity and Judaism as different stages of the same religion coming from Adam. And Islam is represented as the last stage of the same religion coming from Adam. These are apparently accepted. But the other religions like Hinduism or Buddhism or the different world religions, even though they are not expressed in this way, the Islamic teaching says there are more than 100,000 prophets came to the world in the name of God. And we don't know the name of each of them. We know just a few of them, maybe 20, 30. So there might be the case that all the other religions stem from a teaching of a prophet whose name was lost and forgotten in time. However, with respect to the concept of God, do all religions currently forms of these religions pray to the same God? It depends on what we mean by God, I think. There are two ways. This issue is related to philosophy of language, by the way. There are two ways to refer to a certain object. Either we use certain descriptions to identify a certain object which we have vision or in contact. For example, the lady over there who is drinking wine. The description might be false because the lady might have drunk cherry juice, not wine. But everybody knows whom I'm referring to. The other way is just using descriptions because we don't have anybody in our vision. We use, for example, the current president of the United States. Everybody knows that this is Joe Biden, not anybody else. But we don't know, he is not in our vision right now, but the description enables us to refer to him successfully. With respect to God, it is difficult to use just referring descriptions in the first example, because whatever we have in our vision, even in the extreme Sufi experience, we don't know what it is. I mean, how do I claim that it is the God we are talking about, the same God? The only way possible here is by means of descriptions. And if we can agree on a minimum condition for the description of God, we can talk about the same God. And the rest would be a kind of discussion.
Okay, in African religions, Motsamai, you talk about that there could be monotheistic rivals. I love the word rivals to the standard interpretation of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition that could come out of Africa. So I really focused on that. So what would that mean about worshiping the same God if there may be a monotheistic rival?
Well, that's why I'm saying maybe we should start here. The idea of worship, maybe as used in this context, might need some clarification. As I indicated earlier, there is no culture, in African tradition where people converge, in a particular location to say we're here to worship God. It's a very strange idea in African culture that the being so excellent requires such kind of entertainment and engagement, right? So that's a very first idea that's very peculiar about this approach that and that is why this religion does not that's why you'll not find big institutions where people come together and where there are codes of worship, right? It's not even an institutionalized religion. Right? And that is why also what's interesting about it, and it doesn't tend to be a proselytizing religion, You know, you don't find people being invited, hey, come worship our God, we have a true God and all of that, right? So that begins to problematize even the question itself, you know. So what you tend to find, it's this question of whether there are many gods or many religions and all of that. It's a question that's really indifferent in this tradition, right? You know, for the most part, it is left to individuals to decide how will they engage, you know, whoever they think is God, and so very roughly, so it's something like that.
Okay, very good. Sam, in the Jewish tradition, I know we have the Noahide laws, which are for everyone to follow. So tell me a little bit about that, and please keep it short.
Sure, I'll keep it as brief as I can. So the idea is that Judaism is really the record of God's relationship with the Jewish people, but that doesn't have to be exclusive in the sense that you might take it. God is thought in the Jewish religion to have a relationship with all peoples. Judaism is the record of God's relationship with the Jewish people. The story of Noah in the Bible, Noach, was before the rise of Judaism. And the thought is that God made certain basic moral demands of Noach that all human beings have to follow, and that Judaism is just one kind of specification of that within a particular tribal or cultural context. We're not like these African religions. We are not a proselytizing religion, so we're not seeking to make other people Jewish, though they can join the tribe in various ways. You can become a Jew. And therefore, I think any coherent, consistent Jewish theology is going to have to say, in conjunction with this notion of Noahide religion, putting down some basic moral parameters on what any religion has to meet, that other religions are also legitimate ways for non-Jewish people to have a meaningful relationship with God. And I'd go so far as to say, this is now my personal view, even though Judaism says there are some false gods, and that was talking about the notion of these regional deities that were believed in the ancient Near East, like Baal and other kind of regional gods. I would go so far as to say that anybody who believes that there is a singular God who is the cause of the entire universe is talking about the same being, even if they have all sorts of disagreements about it. And I say this just personally, I think that it's a confusion in the philosophy of language. I accept Nazif's basic portrayal of some of the options in the philosophy of language. And I think it's a confusion in the philosophy of language to think that people who call themselves monotheists today are worshipping different gods. It's quite clear to me, at least, that they're worshipping the same God.
We don't have time to go into the overt contradictions between the approaches to that God, but people who would be atheist or agnostic or challenge religion would certainly point to those. Jessica, from the standpoint of Hinduism, what I'd like you to do is reflect upon the deep importance of metaphysical religion. You talk about the phenomenology of metaphysical religion and how, if that's your basis, how it would then reflect on the question, is everyone worshiping the same God, even if there are, which there are, these kinds of contradictions?
Well, it's a bit like asking, is everybody studying the same universe? Right? Clearly they are, but they're going to get really different pictures and theories and accounts of what it looks like based on their methodologies, their perspective, their history, etc. Remember, Hinduism already is polytheistic. It already has one reality, taking many divine forms, and even the gods take different forms. They're not really worried about other people's gods. They're so unjealous, these gods. They're happy for everyone to have some truth. But to answer your question about truth, they use two images for the divine. It can be like a diamond, where from a different angle, you'll see different lights and colors coming out. But the essence of the diamond is harder to capture. They also use the image of an ocean where you see the waves, right? But at the same time, to understand the ocean under the waves is much harder to perceive and to get a whole account of, right? So you can be worshiping it, but not everybody's truth about it will be the same, will be equally accurate even. So in a way, I think Hinduism wants to problematize that idea that we're just looking at the same thing and it's all equally true. It can all be God, but not everybody will do the same thing with that idea, right? So there's still a journey to go on epistemologically.
Okay, this has been terrific. We have a whole bunch of questions coming in, and I want to get an opportunity to have as many of these surface. So please give us short answers. As Einstein said, make it as simple as possible and as short as possible, but not simpler or not shorter. So be complete, but be short to have my own kind of contradiction here. Okay, first question. Nazif mentioned an Islamic cosmological argument which seeks to prove the existence of God as a necessary being. The word necessary is one of those critical modal aspects of philosophy that's super critical. So God is a necessary being. So Jessica, here's a question. The notion of necessary existence, is that compatible with the Hindu concept of Brahman or ultimate reality?
It's a really interesting question, hard to answer. In short, I think the kind of modal logic, the kind of those questions about possible worlds and what necessity means that we have in modern Western philosophy, you don't see an immediate obvious correlate in the Indian context. What you see is a kind of a reverse ontological argument, I think, where they say, look, whatever it is that is necessary, whatever is the necessary feature of the universe, that has a kind of self-existence and fundamentality that already is, in a sense, divine, right? So for them, it's not that you need to prove that God is necessary. You find what's necessary, and from there, you start to get to God.
Motsamai, do you find this question of a necessary God, maybe it's just implicit in African traditional religion, and it's so obvious you don't need to deal with it, but how do you deal with that concept of a necessary being?
Well, so the concept of necessary being seems to be important if you also want to deal with the concept of, you want to explain the order that is posited in, the metaphysical structures that you see in African thought. So the world is represented through a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is a particular order, with some beings being on top and some being at the bottom. And this order, is regulated by some rules. And the question, how do you account for this order? How do you make sense of this metaphysical order? It seems then the necessary being is required to make sense of this metaphysical order.
Okay, next question deals with trying to get a cross-cultural understanding of mysticism and knowing God by detaching ourselves from worldly desires and concerns. Let me just give you an experience I had one time in Jerusalem. Within this period of a couple of days, I visited a madrasa, an Islamic religious organization that was learning. And then I did the same thing in Judaism with a very religious yeshiva. And I tell you, I've studied religion and have it in my background. If I wasn't told ahead of time where I was going and knew where I was going, I couldn't tell the difference in terms of the attitudes and the way they were seated and their whole approach. And it really was a revelation to me that we talk about these differences in religion, but this mystical experience is so similar. And so I want to get your reaction to that in terms of the importance of the mystical experience or meditation or prayer in the different religions. Sam, how do you react?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's hard to deny, and nor should we seek to deny these remarkable kind of structural similarities between various expressions of religion globally, and of kind of a mystical impulse. We started this whole discussion thinking about proofs of God and the role that proofs of God play, but there's a sense in which I find monotheism so convincing for two reasons. One is not I prove that God exists and then what? I assume that God exists, and then I try and explain all the things I see around me in reference to that assumption, and it seems to work. It plays a really good. It plays a role really. And the second thing, which is related to this, is I see, wow. I know we have disagreements. The Christians believe in the Trinity, and Hindus have a very different conception because of their monism of certain underlying metaphysics. But wow, look how much we have in common. It seems to me like we're probably all responding to a similar stimulus. which is, I like Jessica's image of this diamond that we're all catching a partial glimpse of. And, you know, so it, in a sense, it doesn't surprise me that we all have these similarities in our religious sensibilities, modes of worship. If anything, I take it as a kind of evidence that we're all reacting to the same sort of thing.
Jessica, it is the common conventional wisdom that in Buddhism, such experiences, meditation, contemplation is far more important than in other religions. In fact, you really can't do Buddhism unless you do that, which is not the case in the other traditions we're talking about. So I'd like to get your analysis of the role of mysticism and personal experience in Buddhism and also Hinduism.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Okay, so there's a difference between knowing the truth about God and seeing it, right? In the same way that you can know the truth about yourself, but not yet have actually realized that in your actual activity and your way of thinking, right? So in a sense, as well as a philosophical transformation and understanding, you need what you call a phenomenological or a experiential one. In Buddhism, that's important because Buddhism is not really aimed at trying to help us know the truth about reality. It wants you to deconstruct the assumptions that are wrong that are making you unhappy. Right? Buddhism, in a sense, is a therapy. It's a psychology. It's a method for seeing truly so that you'll live better. And that's why they need you to experience it and not just to kind of know it in an abstract way. Hinduism similarly actually says you can know it, but it won't do anything for you. It's just an interesting bit of information. But if you really know it in such a way that is kind of almost as Spinoza says, you're now living with this knowledge of what the reality is and what you are in it, and you are changed as a being, that's the ultimate goal. That's, in a sense, Pierre Hadot's beautiful book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. The ultimate goal is to live philosophy and not just have it as a useful and interesting, trivial bit of information in the back of your drawer.
Okay, we are running out of time. I wish we could go for several months in this conversation, but we are out of time. I do appreciate everyone's participation. Thanks to Eugen Nagasawa, University of Birmingham, for this great vision of the global philosophy of religion. I think today we've had a little microcosm of what a global philosophy of religion should be. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.